Police searched everywhere, chasing lies and false leads. The case dragged on, leaving the family desperate for answers. Detectives, tired and near defeat, pressed forward. Then, in one unforgettable moment, the truth surfaced. A common object, ignored again and again, revealed itself as the weapon. Its markings told the story no one could deny. Shock filled the room. The killer's silence shattered, and justice finally stood clear. What had been hidden was never hidden at all. It was right there in plain sight, waiting to be seen.
Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.
The call came just after dawn, a ringing phone that shattered the silence of a neighborhood still wrapped in sleep. It was the kind of call no one forgets, the kind that begins with urgency and ends with tragedy. Officers arrived at a small, two-story house with paint peeling from its windowsills and a front yard littered with toys now frozen in stillness. Inside, they found a scene that would haunt them. The victim lay motionless in the living room, a blanket half-draped across the couch as though life had been interrupted mid-breath. The air carried a sharpness, a silence that felt louder than any scream. Family members stood outside, trembling, unable to process the reality that someone they loved had been taken in the night. Neighbors gathered near the taped-off driveway, whispering in disbelief. Detectives moved quickly, their notebooks open, cameras flashing, gloves snapping into place. They collected fingerprints from doorknobs and window frames. They bagged fibers from the carpet, slips of paper from the coffee table, even the smudges on a half-empty glass sitting on the floor. Every detail mattered. Every fragment might hold the answer to the question that hung in the air. Who had done this and why? But even as they documented every corner of the room, frustration settled in early. Nothing seemed to add up. The window showed no sign of forced entry. The door lock was untouched. A neighbor swore they had seen no stranger enter the house. It felt impossibly as though the crime had unfolded in plain sight without leaving a trace. Hours turned into days. Interrogations began, each suspect pulled into the fluorescent-lit room where detectives worked to untangle truth from lies. Alibis clashed, voices wavered, and yet no confession came. One man claimed he had been at work all night, a coworker's testimony backing his story. Another insisted he had been asleep at home, though his timeline carried gaps he could not fill. And still, no evidence connected them directly to the scene. The family grew restless. Their grief hardened into frustration. They wanted answers, not promises of progress. Mothers, fathers, siblings, they gathered outside the precinct, their faces pale, their voices cracking as they asked why nothing had been solved. Detectives gave the only answer they could. They were working tirelessly, leaving no stone unturned. But inside, the team felt the weight of failure pressing down. What haunted them most was not the complexity of the case, but the simplicity. They had collected dozens of items, tested them, logged them into folders and evidence lockers. Yet none spoke clearly. None revealed the truth. Every time they believed they had found the missing piece, forensics returned with the same answer. No match, no connection, no breakthrough. Still, they pressed on. They revisited the crime scene, retracing steps, reviewing photos, walking the same narrow hallways again and again. They opened drawers, lifted cushions, even inspected the garden outside. Nothing new appeared. It was as if the house itself had grown tired of their search, mocking them with silence. And then came the moment. A detective, drained by hours of failure, sat down in the same room where the body had been found. His eyes swept across the space, not with the sharpness of a fresh investigator, but with the fatigue of someone desperate for something, anything that made sense. His gaze landed on an object, something ordinary, something that had been there the entire time. It was so familiar that no one had questioned it. It blended into the background, a piece of the room like the furniture or the curtains. But now, under the weight of exhaustion, its presence seemed louder. Its shape, its markings, its position, all suddenly begged for attention. The detective rose, walked over, and lifted it carefully. The room fell quiet as others turned to see what he was holding. Gloves brushed over scratches carved into its surface, grooves that did not belong to casual use. It was heavy in his hand, heavier than it should have been. And in that weight, in those scratches, the possibility of truth stirred. The object was bagged, labeled, and sent for testing. For the first time in weeks, detectives felt the stirrings of hope. But hope came with fear, too. If this was the weapon, then it had been sitting in plain sight all along. And that raised a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If they had missed it once, what else had they overlooked? The object rested in a sealed evidence bag, its surface reflecting the harsh glow of the forensic lab lights. Detectives stood on the other side of the glass, their expressions caught between anticipation and doubt. They had held hope before, only to watch it dissolve when tests came back clean. This time they wanted to believe, but belief came at a cost. If this was not the weapon, they would be back at the beginning, empty-handed, exhausted, and without direction. Inside the lab, specialists worked with precision. Every groove, every scratch, every faint smudge was recorded and magnified. The process was meticulous, almost painfully slow. Detectives shifted on their feet, their patience thinning, yet no one dared look away. This was not just evidence. It was a chance at redemption. As hours passed, frustration resurfaced. Nothing obvious revealed itself. Fingerprints were smudged, partial, distorted beyond use. The grooves along the object could have come from anything: wear, time, casual handling. The longer the process stretched on, the more it felt like the weapon was slipping away from them. Meanwhile, outside the lab, the family clung to hope. They visited the precinct, their questions steady, their voices raw. "Is this it? Have you found what we have been waiting for?" Detectives gave careful answers. They spoke of ongoing analysis, of patience, of steps that must be followed. But behind their measured tone was a silent truth. They were just as desperate. They wanted to tell the family that justice was near, but until the lab confirmed it, they could not. The investigation did not pause. While the object was tested, detectives continued to chase leads. They returned to suspects, pressing harder, re-examining alibis. One suspect broke under questioning, admitting he had lied about where he had been. But his new timeline only muddied the waters, placing him near the neighborhood but not at the crime scene. Another suspect remained calm, his answers unchanged, his eyes cold, as if daring detectives to find proof. Every night ended the same. Folders stacked high, evidence spread across tables, and detectives staring at boards filled with photographs and scribbled notes. The weapon in waiting became the silent center of every conversation. Could it be the key, or just another piece of nothing? And then something shifted. In the lab, a technician called for the lead detective. A mark had been found, small, almost invisible to the naked eye, but undeniable under magnification. It was not random, it was deliberate. A faint trace of residue clung to the groove, a chemical signature consistent with blood that had long dried. The news traveled fast. Detectives rushed back to the lab, their exhaustion melting into urgency. For the first time in weeks, the air felt electric, charged with possibility. The weapon had spoken, not loudly, but enough to be heard. The lead detective leaned over the report, reading each line slowly. The findings were not conclusive, not yet, but they pointed in one direction. This object, overlooked by every eye that had entered the crime scene, could indeed be the murder weapon. Excitement rippled through the team, but caution followed close behind. They had been burned before. False hope had a way of breaking even the strongest resolve. Still, they could not deny it. Something real was finally in their hands. Plans were set into motion. The object would undergo deeper analysis. DNA testing, material comparison, microscopic study of its grooves and edges. Detectives arranged new interrogations, ready to confront suspects with the possibility that the weapon had been found. But late that night, as the precinct quieted and only a few remained, unease crept in. One detective stared at the evidence photo pinned to the board, his hand lingering on the edge of the folder. He whispered a thought no one wanted to hear. If this was here all along, why did the killer leave it behind? The question hung heavy in the room. Was it arrogance, carelessness, or something far more deliberate? And as the detectives turned their thoughts back to the object waiting in the lab, a chilling realization formed. The weapon might hold more than proof of the crime. It might hold a message. The next morning, the lab would deliver results that would silence every doubt. But before the sun rose, detectives were left with the same gnawing uncertainty. What truth would the weapon finally reveal? Morning came heavy with anticipation. The precinct felt alive before the sun had fully risen, detectives gathering around the lab with coffee cups clutched in tired hands. For weeks they had chased false leads, their confidence slowly unraveling. Now, everything hinged on a single report. The lead forensic specialist emerged with a folder tucked under one arm. His expression was neutral, but his presence alone pulled every detective to their feet. He placed the folder on the table, slid it forward, and spoke with careful clarity. The object, he said, bore definitive traces of blood. Not only that, it carried microscopic fibers consistent with the clothing the victim had been wearing the night of the murder. The room fell silent. Detectives exchanged glances, the weight of the confirmation pressing against them like a tidal wave. It was no longer speculation. The weapon was real, and it had been overlooked, sitting in plain sight all along. The family was notified with measured words. Detectives explained that progress had been made, that the weapon had been identified, but details remained sealed until the case was closed. Still, hope lit their faces. For the first time since tragedy had struck, they saw the possibility of justice arriving, steady and unstoppable. Tears came, but they were softer now, carrying relief rather than despair. With the weapon confirmed, attention turned sharply back to the suspects. Interrogation rooms were prepared, folders stacked neatly on the tables. The first suspect was brought in, his hands folded tight, his eyes darting to the mirrored glass as though he knew he was being watched. Detectives slid photographs across the table, the weapon, the grooves, the blood. His composure faltered, but only for a moment. He shook his head, insisting he had nothing to do with it. His story bent, but it did not break. The second suspect entered hours later, calm and calculated. His answers came steady, his tone steady, but detectives pressed harder this time. They asked why fibers matched, why the weapon carried what it carried, why his timeline did not align with neighbors' accounts. His voice grew sharp, his words defensive, yet still he did not confess. By nightfall, both men were released. The evidence was damning, but not yet enough for an arrest. Detectives knew the weapon was key, but they needed more: DNA, fingerprints, a direct tie that could not be argued away in court. The frustration was palpable. They had come so close, yet the truth continued to slip through their fingers like smoke. The lead detective stood at the evidence board, staring at the photographs and notes tacked into place. He traced the outline of the weapon with his finger, whispering to himself. There had to be more. The weapon had to tell them what they had missed. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, tension grew. Journalists caught wind of progress, their questions sharp and relentless. The family endured endless calls, strangers offering sympathy, others speculating wildly about suspects. What had been a private tragedy was now a public storm. Detectives doubled their efforts. They sent the weapon for additional testing, scanning every inch for microscopic traces. They re-examined crime scene photos, focusing on the object in its original position. Something about the way it rested, the angle it lay, raised questions. Had it been staged, placed deliberately to be found later? Late one evening, as the team prepared new reports, a discovery rattled them. A folder, one containing critical witness statements, was missing from the evidence room. Panic spread quickly. The room was supposed to be secure, locked and monitored. Yet the folder was gone, its absence undeniable. Detectives searched every corner, checked every log, questioned every officer with access. Nothing. The folder had vanished, and with it, testimony that had narrowed their suspicions. The timing was too sharp, too convenient. Someone had taken it. As the precinct lights flickered in the late hours, detectives faced a chilling truth. They were no longer just chasing a killer. Someone was watching them, moving within their investigation, pulling pieces away just when they were needed most. The weapon had revealed its story, but the case had shifted. Now, the question was not only who killed, but who was trying to keep the truth buried. And as the lead detective stared at the empty space where the folder should have been, he realized something terrifying. The killer might not be hiding anymore. He might be standing closer than anyone had dared to imagine. The missing folder was more than a setback. It was a fracture in the foundation of the investigation. Evidence rooms were supposed to be sanctuaries of order, each file, each photo, each piece of paper cataloged and protected. Now, with one folder gone, trust unraveled. Detectives looked at one another differently. The silence in the precinct grew heavier, not from fatigue this time, but suspicion. Internal affairs was called. Locks were checked, access logs reviewed. Every officer who had touched the evidence room in the past week was interviewed. No one admitted to moving the folder. Yet the absence was undeniable. The witness statements it contained, detailed accounts from neighbors about strange sounds and figures near the house, were critical. Without them, the case weakened, its spine bent under pressure. Whispers filled the corridors. Was it incompetence, negligence, or worse, was someone within the force working against the investigation? The thought was unspoken but heavy, a leak from the inside. The family grew restless. They appeared at the precinct again, their voices rising, their eyes demanding truth. They had been told progress was being made, that the weapon had been identified, that justice was on its way. But now, with news of delays leaking into the press, their patience fractured. A mother's voice trembled as she asked the lead detective why their loved one still had no justice. He gave the only answer he could: they were close. But even as he spoke, his chest tightened with doubt. Outside, journalists gathered in crowds, cameras flashing, headlines buzzing with speculation. Some reported on the missing evidence, others twisted facts into stories of corruption and cover-up. The pressure was relentless. The detectives felt it pressing against them at every step, the world demanding answers they did not yet have. And yet, in the middle of that storm, the weapon returned from retesting. Forensic specialists had gone deeper this time, stripping it down to the smallest traces. They found what had been missed before, a fragment wedged deep in one of the grooves, invisible to the naked eye. DNA confirmed it belonged to the victim. The detectives stared at the report, their exhaustion cracking into relief. It was the proof they had been waiting for. The weapon was not just suggestive, it was definitive. The link was undeniable. Now, with certainty in their hands, they turned back to the suspects. One stood out more than the rest. His alibi had always been thin, his story rigid but shallow. He had brushed off questioning with practiced calm, but the new evidence cut through his defenses. Detectives prepared warrants, ready to move. This time they would bring him in not for questions, but for answers he could no longer evade. But when they arrived at his home, the door hung open. The rooms inside were bare, stripped of anything personal, drawers emptied, closets cleared. It was as if he had known they were coming, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Detectives searched the house top to bottom, their flashlights cutting through empty spaces. They found no trace of him, no belongings left behind except for one. On the kitchen counter lay a single photograph, its corners curled, its surface worn. It was of the victim, smiling, unaware of the darkness that would come. The detectives stood frozen. The photo was not just evidence. It was a message, a taunt, proof that the suspect was ahead of them, watching, moving with precision. The lead detective picked up the photo carefully, sliding it into an evidence folder. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that the suspect was no longer running from them. He was leading them, step by step, into a game they had not realized they were playing. Night fell heavy on the precinct as the team regrouped. The missing folder, the retested weapon, the vanished suspect. Every thread tied back to one truth. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a chase, and the killer was setting the pace. As the detectives stared at the photo left behind, a single question lingered in the silence. What would he leave for them next? The suspect's disappearance cast a shadow heavier than any sleepless night. The precinct buzzed with frantic energy, phones ringing, radios crackling, reports flooding in from checkpoints and roadblocks. Yet every lead collapsed. He had vanished, leaving detectives chasing ghosts. The family returned once more, but this time their grief sharpened into anger. They stood in the precinct lobby, demanding answers, their voices rising over the hum of activity. The mother slammed her fist against the desk, her tears spilling as she cried out that the police had failed them. Detectives lowered their eyes, unable to deny the truth of her words. For all their effort, the killer had slipped through their grasp. Outside, the media swarmed. Journalists crowded the steps, cameras flashing, questions hurled like stones. Why was the suspect not in custody? How could the weapon have been missed for so long? Is there corruption inside the department? Every headline painted the police not as protectors but as failures. Inside the walls of the precinct, doubt spread like wildfire. Whispers about the missing folder resurfaced. How had it disappeared? Who had taken it? And more importantly, who had put it back into circulation with the press? Someone was feeding details to the outside, details no one should have known. The lead detective called a meeting behind closed doors. Folders were spread across the table, photographs pinned to boards, timelines drawn in heavy ink. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the strain. He told his team the truth. The leak was not speculation anymore. It was fact. Someone inside was working against them. The room shifted into uneasy silence. Detectives exchanged wary glances, suspicion creeping in where trust had once stood. Years of working side by side now felt fragile, as though every partnership might conceal betrayal. Meanwhile, the weapon continued to whisper its story. Forensic teams uncovered new details. Tiny flakes of paint lodged in its grooves, paint that matched the very walls of the victim's living room. The discovery confirmed what detectives feared. The murder had not happened elsewhere. It had unfolded right there in the heart of the victim's own home. The family was devastated. To learn the crime had happened in the place they once felt safest was a wound deeper than any before. Their house was no longer just a crime scene. It was a memory that would never be cleansed. Detectives pressed forward. They revisited the timeline, reviewed every camera, every neighbor's account, every piece of surveillance. Slowly, the shape of truth began to emerge. The suspect had not fled across the city, had not vanished into the night. He was closer, much closer, using knowledge of the investigation itself to stay one step ahead. The lead detective stared at the board late one evening, the precinct nearly empty. His eyes traced the photographs, the maps, the strings connecting places and names, and then it struck him. The suspect's movements aligned too perfectly with the investigation's delays. Every time they prepared to close in, he had already moved. Every time evidence went missing, it was just enough to keep them off balance. The betrayal was not just possible, it was certain. Someone inside the precinct was feeding him their every move. The realization cut deeper than any failure before. It meant the investigation was not just about finding a killer. It was about exposing the rot within their own walls. The next morning, tension exploded when the missing folder suddenly reappeared. Not in the evidence room, not in the chain of custody, but on the lead detective's desk. No note. No explanation. Just the folder returned as silently as it had disappeared. The detectives stared at it, their unease turning to dread. Its reappearance was not a gift, it was a message. The killer was not running, he was watching. The question was no longer where he had gone. It was where he was hiding. The folder sat heavy on the lead detective's desk, its presence louder than words. Every eye in the room fixed on it, the silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights above. It was not just evidence returned. It was proof. Proof that the suspect or someone working with him was inside their world, close enough to touch their files, bold enough to leave them behind like a calling card. The lead detective opened it carefully, each page familiar, each statement one they had already memorized. Nothing had changed. No new marks, no missing testimonies. Yet its very return was more damning than anything written inside. The killer was toying with them, reminding them he was watching. The precinct moved into lockdown. Access tightened. Every detective, every officer, every clerk was scrutinized. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. And in that tightening circle, cracks began to show. One officer, a man long considered reliable, grew restless under questioning. His stories faltered. His timeline shifted. Investigators dug deeper and discovered what they had feared. The officer had been feeding information to the suspect, warnings, delays, details about search warrants. He was not the killer, but he was the shadow inside the walls, the voice that had kept the suspect one step ahead. When confronted, his defense crumbled. He admitted to passing information, but claimed he had never believed the suspect capable of murder. Money had changed hands, promises had been made, and by the time truth surfaced, it was too late to stop. The betrayal cut deep. Detectives who had once trusted him now looked at him with cold disbelief. The force had been wounded from within, but even betrayal could not silence the weapon. Forensic results came back definitive. The blood, the fibers, the paint, every trace pointed to one man. The suspect. His disappearance had not erased the evidence. It had only delayed the inevitable. Detectives tracked him with renewed determination. They followed financial records, traced phone calls, dug into every shadow he had tried to hide within. And then, one evening, the breakthrough came. Surveillance footage from a distant gas station showed him, hood pulled low, face partially hidden. But it was him. He was close, too close, and he had grown careless. The chase ignited. Units moved swiftly, corners closed, safe houses raided. And finally, in a rundown apartment near the edge of the city, they found him. He did not fight. He did not run. He sat at a table, hands folded, eyes locked on the detectives as if he had been waiting for them. The weapon lay on the table between them, sealed in its evidence bag. It was placed there deliberately, a silent reminder that the truth had always been in plain sight. The suspect's composure cracked. His voice trembled as he asked how they had found him, why the weapon had not been discarded. The lead detective leaned forward, his voice steady, because arrogance leaves traces and silence cannot erase the weight of proof. The confession came slowly, a story unraveling piece by piece. He admitted to the crime, to the rage that had driven him, to the mistake of leaving the weapon where it lay. He confessed, too, to the manipulation of the investigation, the games he had played to stay ahead. But in the end, none of it mattered. The weapon had spoken, louder than any lie. In court, the evidence told the story once more. The jury listened as experts described the grooves, the fibers, the blood. The family sat in silence, their faces pale, their hands clasped together. When the verdict was read, guilty, their tears fell freely. This time they were not tears of despair, but of release. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. The weapon, ordinary and overlooked, became the anchor of the case. It was held up in court, its scratches and weight now symbols of truth. What had once blended into the background became the voice that ended the silence. But justice did not erase the scars. Detectives carried the weight of their mistakes, the weeks of missed chances, the betrayal within their own walls. The family carried the loss of someone who would never return, and the city carried the memory of a case where the weapon had never been hidden at all. As the precinct lights dimmed in the quiet after the trial, the lead detective stared once more at the evidence board. The photographs, the notes, the faces of suspects, all now resolved. Yet one question lingered, echoing in his thoughts. How many other truths sit in plain sight, waiting to be seen?
What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Click here to watch the next video as we uncover another thrilling crime case.